This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely all you need to know about me. The aim of this podcast, though, is given away in its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stories, marketing, release, all that kind of stuff, really. All those little ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The movies that I pick tend to have a bit of a mainstream leaning. They're films I'm invested in to some degree as well and interested in. I don't do snark. I make no apologies for that, nor am I being snarky about people who like snark. I'm just not very good at it. And instead, I just waffle on too much about films. And I really like the two films I'm talking about in this episode. So I'm going to shut up and play you a clip from the first of those two films, and I'll come to its story the other side of this.
Rockets in the tool chest, right?
Yeah. Why?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have an emergency. Please clear the field.
What are you, out of your mind? Ladies and gentlemen, well, I guess we had your fooled there for a minute. But it's all part of the show. Stay in your seats, please.
Now, I have never met anyone who doesn't like this film. This is 1991's The Rocketeer, directed by Joe Johnston, written by Danny Bilson, Paul DeMeo, William Deere, they get the story credit. The screenplay credit goes to Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, and based on the graphic novel The Rocketeer by Dave Stevens. The cast, well, Bill Campbell led the cast. He's now Billy, but he was Bill back then. Jennifer Connelly, Alan Arkin, Timothy Dalton, Paul Savino, Terry O'Quinn in the ensemble as well. And the story of this one began nearly a decade before we actually saw it on the big screen with comic book artist and writer Dave Stevens. And he created The Rocketeer in strip form back in 1982, and from the off he knew that there was a film project in there. And he wasn't alone. The Rocketeer soon came to the attention of Steve Miner, who at that point had made Friday the 13th Part 2 and 3. He'd also go on to direct Warlock and Halloween H20, but at this point, with two features of director under his belt, he was interested in bringing The Rocketeer to the screen, so he took an option on the character and the story in 1983, and he set to work trying to fashion it into a movie. But after a year or two, it wasn't really going the right way. And in 1985, his option expired and the rights went back to Dave Stevens. Now, separately, writers Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, they discovered the comic book at a Los Angeles comic book store on a lunch break. At this point, they were working on some B-movies for a small studio, and they recounted this tale at a 20th anniversary reunion panel for the movie that was reported by the Hollywood Reporter, and they said that they found the comic book. At this point, they'd made a low-budget film of their own called Zone Troopers, and they approached Stevens. They showed him their film, and they asked for the rights to develop The Rocketeer into a movie, and Stevens was impressed. He felt that they got it, and he gave them a free-of-charge option to develop The Rocketeer film. And as he said in an extensive interview with Comic Book Artist magazine, he said, quote, "I believed in them enough to give them a free option for as long as it took to sell it, because I really felt they had the right sensibility for it. They came from the same roots as me. They understood what I was reaching for." But other people were reading the Rocketeer comic as well, and other people were interested. One of those people was William Deere, Bill Deere as he was known, and he was a fan. And at this point, he was directing the film Harry and the Hendersons, known as Bigfoot and the Hendersons in some places in the world. And he sought Stevens out and with the idea of directing a Rocketeer film. Now, but before Deere came along, the writer Demir Bilson and Stevens had considered making The Rocketeer as a black and white, quirkier, independent feature, a much lower cost one. But it was Bill Deere coming in who persuaded them to go bigger, to expand the canvas, to go more ambitious. And so in 1986, the three of them went out to Hollywood and they pitched a Rocketeer movie to every studio in town. The problem being, this was many years after the last hit Superman film. It was 3 years before Batman would transform studios' idea of comic book and superhero films. Disney itself wouldn't make Dick Tracy until 1990. It was a barren time for films of this ilk. One thing Deere had helped in particular with was by expanding the canvas. The price of the film had gone up, and they realised that your movie needed to cost at least in the region of $5 million at this point before a studio would give you any time for a meeting. So they did the rounds of the studios, and pretty much every studio turned them down with the exception of one, and that studio was Disney. Disney's eyes were pretty instantly on a potential toy line for the Rocketeer, and Disney's toy business is of course hugely successful, and so it was interested, and it was interested to the point where it was going to look to develop the film not just as one film as the original idea went, but the idea of a trilogy of Rocketeer movies. Imagine all the toys it could shift doing that. And then this was also going to be released under Disney's Touchstone Pictures banner. And Touchstone, if you're unfamiliar with it, was the banner that Disney created to allow it to do slightly edgier fare, that it didn't all have to be hugely family friendly if it went out with a Touchstone logo on the front of it. So they had a path forward with the film. Now, Disney wasn't particularly keen on Bill Deere directing the movie. And so a change in the director was coming, but also they had internal politics going on as well. When the film came onto the radar of Disney's movie chief at that point, Jeffrey Katzenberg. Now, Katzenberg is a name who comes up an awful lot on these podcasts, I've noticed. And at this point, he was of the view that The Rocketeer was better suited to be a Walt Disney Pictures live-action release rather than a Touchstone project. That if it went out with the Disney label on it, well, there's potentially a big film there. And also, if it went with the Disney logo, I presume that there's a bigger market for the toys as well. And so the decision was made. And as such, any adult, not in that way, elements of the movie were having to be shaved off. And as Stevens would say at the time, they were more interested in the name and the toys than the actual shape of the film itself. But nonetheless, it was going to pursue the movie. Writing work continued on it, and a green light was going to be given. Now, separately to this, Joe Johnston, a veteran of the likes of the Star Wars films, had made his directorial debut with a Disney production of his own, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. That is a film I will be coming to in a future Film Stories podcast. And as a consequence of working with Disney on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, he had no urge to ever work with Disney again in a hurry. He would tell the Rocketeer Minute podcast, and that's a terrific podcast, well worth seeking out if you're a Rocketeer fan, that working with Disney was, quote, a challenge. And he talked of the confrontations that he had with Disney and the people in charge of the studio. Now, separately, he's another person who'd become aware of the Rocketeer and was interested in turning it into a feature. And at first, he didn't know who controlled the rights to it. He'd seen the graphic novel, And he asked his agent to look into the project to see which of the studios in town, if any of them, had an option on it. And he was thrilled to bits to discover that Disney had the rights. And so there was a moment where he had to consider, given that he'd come off a torrid experience with the studio on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, whether he wanted to go back and work with Disney again. Well, he wanted to make The Rocketeer, and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids had turned into a gigantic surprise hit for the studio. That it wasn't that it was a surprise that it was a hit, but just how successful and how profitable it was, that took a lot of people aback. So Johnson went in and he made his pitch to Disney, and he said to the studio brass there that he didn't want to make a film. He told this to the Rocketeer Minute podcast. He didn't want to make a film that looked like it had been made in the 1930s, which was the setting of the comic books. But he wanted to capture that period, and he wanted to get the look of it, the look and feel of it, but not for the film itself to look like it was an old film. And that's what pricked Disney's ears up, that there was a take there that it could get behind. It wasn't particularly keen to make a historical period movie. Although writers Bilson and DeMeo would point out to Disney that the Indiana Jones films hadn't done particularly badly. But Johnson, and his quote was, he wanted to come up with, quote, a hand-tinted postcard of Los Angeles in the 1930s. The pitch went well, but also the pitch went well in large part because Honey, I Shrunk the Kids had made an enormous amount of money for the studio. Johnson was thus duly signed on to direct the movie, and it was moving forward. Now, script work was continuing, and at one stage, I gather Frank Darabont, the writer-director of The Shawshank Redemption, was brought in to do a little extra work on the screenplay. But it was coming to a point where it was ready to go. So then attention turned to the matter of casting, and Disney launching a summer blockbuster, which is what the film was ultimately going to be positioned as, would need a movie star, it reconciled, to sell it. Now, The Rocketeer came out in the summer of 1991, and to put that into context, it was going up against Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Kevin Costner in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Bruce Willis in Hudson Hawk. Covered a couple of those films before, but this was movie star season. And so Disney's idea was for the lead of The Rocketeer, the role of Cliff, to be played by Johnny Depp. He was the top choice for the studio, and thus Johnson and Depp and Jeffrey Katzenberg went to have lunch together. Now, Depp at this time was filming Edward Scissorhands, and he was in his Edward Scissorhands costume, or no, not the scissors, and makeup when they met for the lunch. Before they had the meeting, Katzenberg just took Johnson aside and said, look, if you want him for the film, we just need to come up with a signal. Just ask me to pass the salt, and then I'll know that you want him. And so they had the chat. They had a very pleasant lunch. Depp couldn't eat because it would have messed up his Edward Scissorhands makeup, but Johnston liked Johnny Depp. He thought he would work for the role, and he looked at the table and noticed that the salt was right by him, so he couldn't really ask Katzenberg to pass it over. Instead, they had a chunter once the lunch was over, and the offer was put forward to Depp, but for one reason or another, Depp wasn't really keen on doing the film, and thus the search for Cliff went on. Auditions continued. Bill Paxton would tell Entertainment Weekly in the summer of 1991 that he came really close to landing the role. He'd auditioned, the late great Bill Paxton, he'd auditioned for him. It wasn't until 2000, also in Entertainment Weekly actually, that Vincent D'Onofrio revealed that he'd been offered the role of Cliff in The Rocketeer. And he said, he was quoted in Entertainment Weekly as saying, quote, "Thank God I had time to think about it. Everything was leaning to, whoa, all this in bread and this big movie, it'll be cool. Then I had this vision of myself in the costume, me, this big guy with a rocket on his back, and I thought, I can't do this. This is ridiculous." And he turned the role down. In then came Bill Campbell to audition, then pretty much an unknown, certainly in movie circles an unknown. He'd done a little bit of soap opera television work. Johnston saw something in him straight away. Now, Campbell hadn't been familiar with The Rocketeer, but he did his research to the point where he turned up for his auditions with a haircut in line with the comic book look of the character of Cliff. And Johnston really took to him and fought hard to cast him in the lead role. And he did have to fight to do it, because this was not the movie star star that Disney envisaged for its summer film. But after a lot of toing and froing, Johnston got the green light to cast Bill Campbell in the role. For the role of Jenny, there were the actors in consideration were said to be the likes of Diane Lane, Sherilyn Fenn, Elizabeth McGovern, but it was Jennifer Connelly who ultimately landed the role. The villainous Neville Sinclair, I think it's pretty well known that Errol Flynn was the template for the character. Jeremy Irons was said to have been the first to have been offered the role of the foe in The Rocketeer, but he said no to it. Charles Dance's name also was put into the mix, but it was Timothy Dalton who ultimately came in and took it on. It's why you get little lines in the film about him doing all his own stunts, which is a nod to his James Bond work. This was his first major studio film after finishing his stint as James Bond, although he didn't know he'd finished his stint as James Bond there. Did a podcast on License to Kill if you want that story. One other just little casting aside, Joe Pesci was said to be in the role for Eddie Valentine, to the point where the role was pretty much written for him, but he turned the job down, and it was Paul Sorvino who ultimately took that part on. Nonetheless, this was ready to go. A $25 million budget was allocated by Disney. Disney was not the most it wasn't one to throw its money around at this point, and it was notoriously fairly tight on its budget. But $25 million for a film like this, that seemed like a reasonable amount at this stage. And filming got underway in the middle of September 1990, with and the production the main bulk of filming would then go through until January 1991. Now, this was going to be a heavily practically driven film as well, and as primarily because the cost of computer effects work and what they could realise at the point this film was being made, well, the cost was prohibitive, and what you could actually get a computer to do on the budget they were working to was pretty minimal. So they knew they had to use old style model work and matte paintings, and also do stuff for real. As Johnston would say, 1991 was the beginning of things you could do digitally on the screen, and he did say that he thinks there's no CG in the film, even though ultimately, looking back now, he wished there was a little bit in there. But he was happy with his cast, he got the budget, it was full steam ahead. Now, there's a notable plane in the movie, the GB plane, and preparation was underway for the movie, and the search was on for a plane, and Johnston was thinking, well, we're just going to have to build a replica that just won't be able to fly. But he got a stroke of luck that the production team found a GB replica plane that had been built that was for sale. Now, it was a replica that had been built to the original specs with one or two corrections to make it a bit safer to fly. It was painted the right colour for the film as well. And it had gone, when they noticed it, it had been on sale for 2 days, and all concerned thought someone is going to snap this up and fast. So Johnston went to Disney and said, look, this is an airworthy version, example of the plane we need in our film. It's probably the only one out there, and someone is going to buy this if we don't move quickly. It's going to cost us $25,000, which looked like a bargain as well. And so Johnston just wanted Disney to stump up, and Disney dithered. And it wasn't because it didn't believe in the plane or anything like that. It had to go up the corporate chain to get the necessary permissions and the purchase orders and the sign-offs and what have you to get this thing bought. So Johnston didn't dither. Instead, he went out and he bought the plane himself with his own money at that stage, presumably his slice of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids profits. I don't think he was on a profit thing, but he would have done reasonably well out of that, you'd hope. And thus, for 5-6 weeks, he owned this plane that he bought for $25,000 before Disney management finally said yes, and Johnston then in turn sold it on to Disney. Now, he did say he didn't take a profit on it. He charged them the same price, but he probably missed a little bit of an opportunity there. Disney Disney executives were watching the footage that was coming in and had some comments that didn't quite gel. Notably, that there's Bill Campbell in the movie does. He got into one of these old planes for real and shot flying footage was shot in the sky. Now, Johnston obviously didn't ask Disney permission to do this at this stage because Disney would have said no, but they shot the footage. and the daily footage was sent off to the studio, and he got a note a few days later from an executive who'd watched this footage saying that the footage looked fake. That the note said, quote, "This process photography doesn't look real." And so Johnston had to ring up this executive and say, well, we did it for real. It might not look real, but that's the real thing. And at that point, Disney became wise to the way that Johnston had got this footage in the first place and was not particularly happy about it. I think the polite version of the story is he was told not to do it again. The actual GB that was used in filming was also, it's worth noting, only allowed to land a few times during its time on the film because the landing gear of the plane is quite tricky and it's a tricky landing to pull off. So they needed to minimise the amount of time they actually used it in the sky. There was another note from a Disney executive as well over there's early archive footage that we see in the movie of Nazi rocket tests where you see Hitler. There aren't that many Disney films, as the Rocketeer podcast noted, that have Hitler in them. Thus, a note came in from a Disney executive just criticising the fact that they'd bought stock footage of Hitler for the movie. That wasn't a good look for Disney, really. But as it turned out, they hadn't. I mean, there are, as Johnston has pointed out, there isn't actually that much stock footage you can buy of the Nazis testing rocket packs. Instead, what they did is they filmed the footage themselves, and they took the short order cook from elsewhere in the movie, who looked enough like Hitler for them to get away with the shots that they actually needed. Now, Dave Stevens was involved throughout the production, and he lent to his production team his huge reference library of materials, and Joe Johnston certainly kept him close to the making of the film. But and so it all wrapped up. But after filming principal photography had finished, they had to come back in March of 1991 to film a big sequence in the movie. I'm going a bit spoilery at this stage. There is a sequence towards the end of the film involving a Luxembourg Zeppelin, and it's obviously a huge ship, and it was required to be destroyed for the sequence in the sequence that we're talking about. Now, it was a really complex model to make. It took 6 weeks to put this Luxembourg together. It was the frame was laser cut, and thankfully, as it turned out, they kept the backups for the frame as well. But only one of these was initially made, and thus they had the proverbial one chance to get this shot. And they didn't get it. The first attempt to blow this up went badly wrong. And predictably, this is when an Entertainment Weekly reporter was on set as well. And this was all detailed in an article that came out a couple of weeks after the film's release. Johnston would say that the footage they got at that first attempt was pretty horrifying. And he said it went very badly wrong. The kind of thing where everyone is sort of standing there with their mouth open saying, what do we do now? Now, this had cost $400,000 to make. It's worth noting that Disney had pumped more money into the film, that it was happy with the look of it, that the budget had gone up from the original 25 million to around 35-40 million instead. Even so, $400,000 just on one sequence, well, that was a huge chunk of what they were spending on it. So they got 5 cameras in that were positioned along an arc, a huge arc, as the Entertainment Weekly article cites, to try and capture the demise of this ship at 350 frames per second. And the idea was, if they shoot it at such a high frame rate, when they project it at 24 frames per second, it will make the model that they built, and it was a sizable model, but it would make the model that they built look a lot bigger and look like it was going down in flames and be hugely dramatic. The problem they got is the explosives that they'd put together to blow this thing up misfired, and, quote, instead of the graceful swan dive they'd hoped for, the Zeppelin's fall looks more like a belly flop. 6 weeks later, they had to go back and do the whole sequence again at notable expense. By this stage, though, Disney was turning its attention to how do you sell the film, and the artwork that they used I still think is beautiful and striking. The Art Deco poster of the Rocketeer was front and centre of the push for the movie, and Disney spent a lot of money promoting the film. It spent around $20 million on promotions for the film, at a point where that was really an awful lot to spend on such things. I'm not saying it isn't now, but I think think that's close to standard. This was Disney really pushing the boat out. Perhaps not quite to the same level they'd done on Dick Tracy the year before, but again, it was trying to position this as a big summer film. There was pushback afterwards about that poster, though, in that, well, did it make the film look like an animated movie? And there were discussions over that. But nonetheless, that was ahead. Those conversations were to come. On the 19th of June 1991, Disney organised the premiere of The Rocketeer at the famous El Capitan Theatre in Hollywood. And this was a big deal. The El Capitan had been closed for 2 years, courtesy of an Art Deco renovation of its own. And so this was a huge thing that Disney was choosing to mark its opening with a Rocketeer movie premiere. The plan walking in was still for at least one sequel to this film, and so the movie was after its premiere was released in America on the 21st of June 1991, and all hopes were on it doing good business. And the problem was, well, it didn't really. It opened at 4th place in the box office that weekend in America, taking 9.6 million. And at this stage, I mean, it opened behind the film Dying Young, starring Julia Roberts. And appreciating Julia Roberts was a movie star, Dying Young was one of her less well-received films and wouldn't go on to do great guns itself. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was still topping the chart at that point. This was its second week. City Slickers had been the surprise hit of the summer. Covered that in a previous Film Stories as well. The other films in and around there, well, Backdraft was at 5. Jungle Fever, that's a great film, at 6. And Hudson Hawk was dropping like a stone at number 12. And that was regarded as the big blockbuster failure, really, of the summer, although I still quite like Hudson Hawk. But it was clear that Disney's hopes for a huge movie with The Rocketeer, well, they hadn't been realised. And even though the critical response to it was strong, the box office just wasn't there. As Dave Stevens would say, when the film didn't perform in the first couple of weeks like they'd anticipated it, they lost faith in it. Joe Johnston would say there was a lot of talk of a sequel on June the 20th, 1991, but there wasn't any on the 22nd. And that's how quickly Disney lost the idea of doing more Rocketeer. Now, even that merchandise, that toy line, I mean, it just sent it all out to around the sides of America, and it really didn't give it much of a push in the end once it realised it didn't have a big hit on its hands. The score from James Horner, I should say, is tremendous. If you get a chance, do seek it out. But the thing, like the score and the film itself, have endured far more than that initial response to the movie might lead you to believe. That it was regarded as a disappointment, commercially at least, when it came out, and yet its reputation has only grown as time has gone on. Now it's regarded as one of the finest summer blockbusters of the 90s, and rightly so. It would land Joe Johnston the Captain America director's job with Marvel, for instance, and there's been in more recent times subsequent talk of a fresh reboot sequel, whatever word they come up with for it, and it now looks like that's actually going ahead after years of talk that it will be a Disney Plus production. Personally, I would take the extended version of Horner's score, which did get a release, thank goodness, and I'd really take a special edition Blu-ray with loads of extras that we never had for the film. All the disc releases of The Rocketeer are really sparse. Lots of people are discovering it now it's landed on Disney Plus, but I do think let's have a huge special edition of The Rocketeer and celebrate this terrific film for the family action-adventure treat it really is. And that brings me to the halfway point of the latest Film Stories. I'm already overrunning, so I'm going to go quickly. If you can help and support me spread the word of this podcast, it would help me enormously. I am an independent. I don't have a big company behind me. I rely on your word of mouth to keep me going, really. If you could subscribe at your podcast repository of choice, that's hugely appreciated. If you could leave me preferably a very nice review, that also helps enormously as well. And thank you so much for doing it. But I'm going to move on quickly to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. And we're coming to far more recent times. It's a comedy I've got a huge amount of time for. Let's do a clip from the trailer. I'll come to it the other side of this.
Tonight is the first night of our adult lives. I want to go to prom and lose my goddamn virginity.
Prom night. It's kind of perfect.
I'm in.
Julie left her laptop open.
You guys are snooping on our kids?
All emojis have a secret meaning.
Oh, eggplants are dicks. This is some kind of a dick-related agreement.
Maybe they're just saying, hey, you're okay with me. You're okay with me.
I mean, maybe.
What?
Our girls are not thinking things through. I'm gonna stop them.
I'm in.
That then is a clip from 2018's Blockers, directed by Kay Cannon. Screenplay credited to Brian Kehoe and Jim Kehoe. Cast of this one, well, it's led by Ike Barinholtz, John Cena, Leslie Mann, Catherine Newton, Geraldine Viswanathan, Gideon Adlon, Ramona Young and Miles Robbins, all in the sizable ensemble. There's also, of course, Gary Cole and Gina Gershon. My lord, their sequences in this are... I'm getting ahead of myself. So, screenwriters Jim and Brian Kehoe, well, they attended the same school and they graduated together in 1992, and they started off doing jobs away from the world of film before they decided to move to Los Angeles and try their hand at the movies. So they worked on the crew of a bunch of productions before Jim Kehoe directed his first movie. Now, this was in 2005, film star Gary Busey. It was going by the name of Overachievers. It's got a slightly different name now, but the pair also co-wrote that. They made some short films and they were gradually working their way up in Hollywood. So they wrote a spec script, and spec scripts, as we talked about before, are basically you write a screenplay that hasn't been commissioned by anyone. The risk is all on you, and the idea is if a studio likes it, you get more money for it. And so they wrote a spec script called Cherries, and this was about a trio of fathers being overprotective of their daughters on prom night. And throughout its development, the idea of it being about three fathers turned into two fathers and a mother. But still, that was the angle of the film. And it was first reported as being in active development in 2012. Now, by that point, the film appeared to have been set up at Point Grey, which is the production company of Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg and James Weaver. The production company Good Universe was also involved. And director Kay Cannon told Esquire magazine, she'd had conversation with Good Universe before about potentially directing things, and she told Esquire magazine, quote, "I was sent the script by my agent with a straight up offer to direct, which was amazing because I'd never directed anything before." Well, she'd certainly written a lot, and Kay Cannon at this point was her highest profile work had been writing the Pitch Perfect films. That and The Small Matter of the numerous episodes of the brilliant 30 Rock that she wrote as well. She was at the point where she created the television series Girl Boss, which lasted for one season, and she was candid in interviews around the time of Blocker's release that when it came to making her directorial debut, she was anticipating it being a television episode or something like that, not a full-blown feature from day one. But she'd got the work, she'd got the offer in part off the back of the film Neighbours 2, which is known as Bad Neighbours 2 here in the UK, and she was working on a round table with other writers on that film. And she would say, I found out much later, just recently actually, that I got the script because when I worked on Neighbours 2, they had a round table with female writers. I guess I sort of took over that room, and it was in that moment when they all felt like I was the right person to direct this movie. So I read the script, I thought it was super funny, and I connected to the themes of the story. Now, Bad Neighbours was set up by Point Grey, which is, of course, Rogen and Goldberg and Weaver's production company. And so the dots all really started to join up at this point. And it was announced for the first time in November 2015 that Kay Cannon had come aboard to direct Blockers. There was still The Small Matter of Girl Boss to make, and she was writing at that point Pitch Perfect 3 as well, but this was going to be her directorial debut. And at the point she came aboard, the film had already gone through quite a lot of rewrites. Screenwriters like John Hurwitz, Hayden Schlossberg and Eben Russell had been involved, but she told the credits that when she first got the script, it was the parents' movie, and she wanted to balance that. She wanted to bring a female perspective to it. And so she would go on a separate interview to tell Vanity Fair that when I received the script, the mum was already there, but there was very, very little for the daughters. And she said, I wanted to show three completely different, relatable stories of who represents high school girls. She introduced a love story, therefore, for the character of Sam for a start, and it was a same-sex love story, and the studio agreed with it. And Cannon said it was a group effort to make sure that it was specific to what high school girls are really truly experiencing, and we couldn't deny that. All mixed in, it should be noted, with a gross out comedy, really. So she developed the script, and she worked with her husband for a while on it, Eben Russell, and she kept coming up with bits and bobs that she felt the film needed, because at one point she wanted to have mothers arguing on pretty much the same point but taking different positions on it. She talks about this, the commentary track on the DVD and Blu-ray, and she says that there's a sequence where in the film where mothers are talking about their daughters growing up, and they talk about discussing holding their daughters to different standards to their sons, and different mothers have different perspectives, and it's a straight out serious moment in the middle of this incredibly funny film. And it was one of those moments that there was some pushback with a possibility of it being cut, but Cannon fought for it and got it into the movie. Universal then officially came aboard the film in January 2017. Now there was a big studio behind it. Several studios were said to be interested in picking up the film, but Universal had put the Bad Neighbours films out, and it got the official green light in January 2017. And at that point, Leslie Mann, Ike Barinholtz and John Cena were announced in the three lead roles of the parents. Now, Kay Cannon had known Ike Barinholtz. They grew up together, and she wanted him for the part, and it would turn out to be his first major comedy lead in a big Hollywood comedy. For John Cena, the role he took on in the film had been rewritten at this point to be a big man with emotion spilling out of him. But even though she thought he'd been great at this point in the film Trainwreck, and it had shown a comedy side to his acting that she was previously unaware of, the transformative moment when she realised that he was the right man for the job was when he hosted the ESPY Awards, the ESPYs, I think, and I'm a Brit, so I had to look this up. This is the Excellence in Sports Performance Yearly Award, which is broadcast by ABC in the US. And Cena was a comedy. His comedy was reportedly excellent. She heard his monologue hosting those awards, and she just felt he was absolutely right for this role. Now, that didn't mean that he didn't have to audition. Cena, obviously, huge wrestling star, but nonetheless the jump to the movies was it wasn't something to be taken for granted. It took Dwayne Johnson a long time to build up to the status that he's at on the big screen now, for instance. But Cena came in, he did his audition, and he turned out to be the second one cast in the film. Not far behind him was the brilliant Leslie Mann, and she got the script just as she was dropping her teenage daughter off at college and saying goodbye to her. And Mann read it and she just said that the script spoke to her. It really hit her, and she said yes to the film pretty much straight away. So this was coming together, and by March of 2017, 2 months after Universal, it had been announced, had given it the formal green light, the announcement came forward that the film was to begin shooting in and around the Atlanta area in the US from April 2017, that the filming was now weeks away, with a view at this stage of releasing the movie in April 2018. Blockers was a go project. There were still the younger members of the cast, the three younger leads in the film that needed to be cast, the three daughters, and lots of young actors were auditioned and were seen for the roles. But in the end, it was Catherine Newton, Gideon Adlon, and Geraldine Viswanathan who were all confirmed and announced in the roles just after production started, actually. But that's when the announcement came out. But it was all locked in by the April start date of the film. relative cameo roles for Gina Gershon and Gary Cole, and Cannon says she's a paid-up fan of Showgirls, and that can't have helped where Gershon can't have harmed Gershon when it came to coming into the movie. With Gary Cole, she was also a huge fan of Office Space, and they just had a lot of fun. She talks about this on the commentary track as well, just improvising them. We come up with bits and bobs for them to do. Miles Robbins, meanwhile, now he takes on one of the younger roles in the film, and he didn't reveal to Kay Cannon who his parents were when he auditioned for the role of Connor, that he sent in a tape of himself and he landed the role, and it was only a little way down the line it became clear that he's actually the son of Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon, but he was in there. The ensemble was complete, and at the point where the film was greenlit and the production began, its name had changed as well. No longer was this film called Cherries. This film was now going by the name of The Pact, named after the pact that the three daughters in the film made to lose their virginity on prom night. Now, Kay Cannon wanted this to speak to a teen audience, and she wanted to capture the feel of some of the feel of the John Hughes movies that were particularly special that she really loved. And so she's been pretty open about the fact that she loves The Breakfast Club, Weird Science, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Pretty in Pink, and the influence on her growing up. She wanted her film to capture how real those films felt, and one of the facets of Hughes's films that she wanted to get was just the geography, that Hughes infamously shot his films in and around Chicago, and the landscapes and the geography of Chicago are huge parts of his movies, and that's what Cannon wanted to tap into as well. Now, they weren't actually filming in Chicago, but instead what you get in the film are lots of little side references and bits and bobs to Chicago sports teams, for instance. And it's just made clear that this is a film that's geographically situated somewhere that's not just huge town America. The prom scene, if you look into the film as well, I mean, one of the touch points there was, again, John Hughes' film, Pretty in Pink. And one of the things about shooting where they were as well, and also because there was such a high school element to this film, is the extras that they were using for the film, well, they needed across a few locations on a few different occasions. And as it turned out, they ended up with a bunch of extras who they worked with over a number of weeks, 3 different weeks in different places in and around the filming of the movie, to the point where they got to know the extras really quite well, as opposed to extras sometimes being a little bit alien on the set of a movie. Cannon was a first-time director at this stage, although clearly a first-time director with a huge amount of experience and insight into the industry. She was up against quite a few of the usual challenges of location filming. There was construction going on next door when some sequences were being shot, for instance. The location work that they were doing near the start of production, well, that had to stop every now and then when the planes went overhead. But she was in the swing of things quickly, and she knew the kind of film that she wanted. So, for instance, one of the points she makes on the commentary track is in films with teen girls, you don't see messy bedrooms very often. You always see messy boys' bedrooms, but not messy girls. So she wanted to just subtly correct little bits and bobs like that. Now, she worked with her cast in rehearsal before filming began, and this gave them all a chance to develop their characters, to alter bits and bobs of the script, come up with ideas. That it wasn't a heavy improvisation on the day movie, that most of what you see in the film was written down in the screenplay, but there was a lot of work reworking things as better ideas came up throughout shooting. Now, Ike Barinholtz, for instance, again, a long-time friend of Kay Cannon, he wanted to be particularly respectful to her as a director, so he didn't want to come up to her on the day in front of everyone and come up with ideas. So he would ring Cannon up in advance and come up with ideas and thoughts that they could implement shooting the following day. But then sometimes Cannon would say, Cannon would tell Esquire, there was a lot of rewriting. Sometimes I'd have the actors doing a scene, and if it wasn't working, I'd rewrite it, or the actors and I would figure it out together. There were scenes, scenes where the actors were sent away to makeup. When they came back, she'd done a bit of rewriting work on it just to give it another angle. There were also little bits in there as well, in that she wanted to make sure that, given that this was a film about three daughters looking to lose their virginity, she wanted to make sure that they give their consent to do so. And a line was put in there that wasn't in originally, just to make sure that that was clear. Perhaps the standout, gross-out comedy bit of the movie is what you could politely call the butt-chugging moment. This was something that was in the screenplay from day one, and there was never any question it wasn't going to remain in the screenplay. Cannon really liked the idea of it. Just showed what John Cena's character in this case was willing to do to, in his eyes, save his daughter. Now, it was still a stressful scene to shoot, in that it involved John Cena, his naked backside, a lot of liquid and a lot of extras milling round, but Cena absolutely went for it, in spite of being surrounded by lots of people. Without going into too much detail, the tube never made its way into him. I think that's the politest way I can put it. And at the point they were shooting it, Cannon was shouting out potential lines for Cena to say, just so they could get coverage and other options in the edit room. And Cena was fully playing along with this and really going for it, I think, as you see in the film. The liquid moment had to be done twice. They went with the first take of that, but they knew, I would imagine, they pretty much had something there. There's also a sequence in the back of the car where the three daughters are indulging in some heavy puking, and this was when it was first cut together, a sequence that wasn't quite working, because rather than it coming across as comedy, it was kind of grossing people out a bit too much and making them feel queasy. And so this is something that Cannon worked with her editor Stacey Schroeder on, and she gives Schroeder a lot of credit for the way she put some of the sequences together. But they were watching Edgar Wright's film Baby Driver around the time they were editing that, and that's where they got the idea of, why don't they cut it to classical music, and that would make it funnier. And in their eyes, and who am I to disagree, it transformed the scene and just made it a lot funnier. Perhaps the hardest scene to shoot, he says, God, that sounds wrong when you realise what I'm about to talk about, was the sequence involves, going to spoiler light as I can, Gary Cole walking around a house with not many clothes on. Now, this was shot over a very long night. I believe it's towards the end of the schedule as well. And Cannon came up with the idea, as it happened, of shooting that entire sequence like the dinosaurs running around the kitchen sequence in Jurassic Park, which I just think is ingenious. You see subtitles in that sequence as well, and that's something the actors and Cannon came up with very late in the day as an idea to do. The hotel sequence you see towards the end of the film as well, that was also a tough one to do, just because a lot of stuff had to be captured. They're on location, and it was right near the end of the shoot when everyone was pretty tired. There were some reshoots, bits and bobs done as well. The very final pre-credit scene in the film, for instance, was reshot a few months after the end of production. A sequence where John Cena is unhindered by clothes. Again, let's go with that. But the film was in the can. It was shot, it was edited, it was tested, and the reshoots were underway. And there was confidence from Universal to the point where the release date was moved forward to March of 2018, but also a premiere for it was being arranged at the South by Southwest Film Festival on the 10th of March 2018. Now, there were obviously challenges still in post-production. There were arguments, for instance, about keeping jokes in the movie. There was one line near the end, for instance, that got some pushback from Evan Goldberg, who wasn't that sure, but also this was a bunch of guys who were succeeding to Kay Cannon's expertise in knowing what would work in a comedy of this ilk. And as it happened, she put the line in question, again, I'm not spoiling it, into a test screening, and recorded the laughter at the test screening, played it back, and she won the battle. And as she would say in an interview with NPR, laughs win. She said, I previewed the movie a bunch of times. The line that you're referring to gets one of the biggest laughs of the movie, you know. And like that's how I tend to win arguments about stuff like that. You know, maybe we haven't seen the line in question coming out of the mouth of women. But if the audience is laughing, then it wins. Then I win. And Cannon, again, fought for something and it worked. There was some, ahead of the premiere, there was some concern that concern's probably the wrong word, but it was just being pushed a little bit as a raunchy comedy, and the line that was going round ahead of the release was, "This is super bad with women." And there was some controversy over the poster for the film, because as it headed towards release, the name of the film changed again to Blockers, which it would end up being called. But a poster was put together with the word Blockers, and perched on top of it was a cockerel. So I'm going to let you just work that out. Obviously we've all got pure minds, so we don't quite know what it's getting at, but that got some pushback and they weren't allowed to use that poster in certain contexts. However, once people saw the film, they realised that not only were they getting a raunchy comedy, but they were getting something a lot deeper and a lot more special, really. And that's no slight to raunchy comedies, but there's a lot of depth to Blockers, and there's a lot of stuff that we just don't see before. Certainly the raunchy comedies that I saw growing up were just all about a bunch of blokes. I don't recall films giving us the perspective of the characters of Julie and of Kayla and of Sam. Likewise, the kiss at the end, again, spoiler alert, which was something the studio didn't push back at all about. It's worth noting that. I mean, that just felt wildly different watching the film. It shouldn't, but it did. The film then debuted at the South by Southwest Festival, and this proved to be a smart move because the response to it was electric. I wasn't at the screening, but the reports of it suggest it pretty much blew the roof off the place. Just over 2 weeks later, it would begin its rollout around the world. We actually got this one in the UK ahead of most countries. It landed in the UK on the 30th of March. The wide American release wouldn't be until the 6th of April. The reviews were strong, though, and the word of mouth in particular was strong too. And whilst it wasn't a massive sensation, initially on its release, this $21 million comedy did good business. It opened in competitive week in the US as well. It was in third place. It took $20 million, $20.5 million on its opening weekend. The week before, Ready Player One had opened, but number one at the box office that week was A Quiet Place, which a huge surprise hit, which had opened to $50 million worth of business. But what's interesting with Blockers is its word of mouth kind of stuck around, that it would go on in the US to do 60 million. It would add 33 million overseas, but by the time it came to its home release, I think it's one of those films whose word just continues to spread and continues to spread and continues to spread. Take this podcast as my contribution to spreading the word about it, because if you need a very, very, very funny comedy that feels very fresh and feels like perspectives you've not seen before, I cannot recommend Blockers enough. Pair it with game night and just have an evening with a huge smile on your face. And that brings me to the end of this latest Film Stories. I've gone on too long again. I am sorry. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. I have a website, www.filmstories.co.uk. It's updated every weekday with features and loads of news stories. We're really trying to give that a push at the moment. That's where you can find out about Film Stories Magazine and Film Stories Junior Magazine and buy copies as well. If you like this podcast and want to financially support it, I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew. The money brought in through Patreon also continues pays writers for our website to make it clickbait free as well, and really helps push everything we're doing. But that's it for this week. I've gone on too long. Thank you so much as always for your time. Most important thing remains, please stay safe. Please look after yourselves. I'll be back in another week with another bunch of film stories. Take care. Bye bye.